Jazz, conceived in Africa, born and raised in America, is a music that embodies American ideals as well as the long social, political, and institutional struggle of Black Americans to have access to those ideals. The beauty of jazz is that such a powerful, breathtaking music arose from pain and strife and gave rise to strength and pride. The history and evolution of jazz follows the history and evolution of African Americans. It is a history filled with talented musicians who broke boundaries as they explored new sounds and rhythms, encountered new people and genres, and exchanged and shared their music to create a new, blended sound that echoes with the beauty of two different cultures brought together as one.
The evolution of jazz begins in West Africa. America was a far-off, yet-to-be-discovered land. The West African tribes and empires consisted of a diverse group of peoples, cultures, and religions, but the power of music was universal. West African folk musicians skillfully utilized a wide range of instruments, including drums, bells, and flutes. A call-and-response style of singing characterized by choir voices and the myriad of rhythms created a complex religious and cultural tradition, as well as a way of self-expression. Music was an outlet, one that would become critical in the dark times ahead.
In 1619, the first African slaves arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. Over the course of the next 2 centuries, millions of Africans will be enslaved on plantations throughout the Americas. They were separated from their homes and families and forced to work under abhorrent conditions in a strange new land. However, nothing, not even thousands of miles of ocean, could separate them from their music. Music was an integral part of a slave's life. While working in fields, slaves sang work songs or field hollers. These field hollers were often characterized by the rhythmic beats and call-and-response style scenes of African religious music. While slave owners assumed these songs were simply for enjoyment and to help pass the time, they were actually a form of communication. Drums were used by slaves to send messages in a sort of Morse code about plans for revolts and escapes. Eventually, some slave owners caught on and drums were banned from plantations, but slaves were way ahead of them. They began using the lyrics of spirituals, religious music often used by slaves to express their pent-up sorrows to communicate. This use of spirituals as a method of communication was particularly clever because slaves were, in a sense, using a form of oppression to free themselves from oppression.
Slave owners and other white plantation workers heard the music of slaves but refused to acknowledge it as music. Slave songs were largely ignored throughout the 1700s. By the 1800s, however, white musicians began to imitate black music during what was known as minstrel shows. During these variety shows, white performers would blacken their face, play slave instruments such as the banjo, sing songs that imitate spiritual and work songs, and even imitate black language. Although the performances were largely comedic and mocking of black music, minstrel shows were some of the earliest instances in which white people recognized and took interest in black music. However, after the Civil War, minstrels, which performers and audience mainly consist of white Southerners, took on a cruel and bitter tone. Harsh stereotypes of blacks were created, and performers stopped seeking black people for the new material. But the times were changing.
During the late 1880s and early 1890s, black musicians were finally able to break out of the mold of minstrelsy with the birth of ragtime. Ragtime is a genre of music characterized by syncopated rhythm, or ragged time. The importance of rhythm and the use of instruments such as the banjo and bones in ragtime, like minstrelsy, can be traced back to early slave songs. The seemingly overnight success of ragtime is largely due to the invention of the pianola, a mechanism that enabled a piano to play itself. This allowed people who may not have been musically endowed to enjoy the syncopated rhythm of talented ragtime musicians such as Scott Joplin. But ragtime was just the beginning, clearing the way for other genres of black music to evolve.
Flash forward to the early 1900s. A young talented musician named W.C. Handy is spending his days hanging around saloons, railroad yards, and docks. He's on a quest to find music, good music. Handy had developed an interest in secular sorrow songs, songs that had their origins in slave spirituals and had undergone a transition with the people who sang them. These songs came to be known as the blues.
As a jazz musician, the most popular song you can play is a blues. And the blues was basically used in slavery, as that's how the slaves would communicate to one another, and that's how they would express themselves. A lot of people look at the blues as a really sad piece because it's a 12-bar form, and sometimes it can be recognized as something that's really depressing. But the thing that I love about the blues is that it can be a form of expression for sadness or a form of expression for happiness or joy.
The immense popularity of the blues spread as much of the black population in the United States migrated to cities. It was the migration of blacks and their music to one particular city that sparked the birth of an entirely new musical genre and burst open the creative floodgate. This city was New Orleans.
After the Civil War, New Orleans was a city brimming with cultural and ethnic diversity. However, restrictive racial codes segregated the city. Blacks and Creoles, a people with a mix of Black, French, Spanish, and Native American ancestry, lived in one section, while whites lived in another. On top of segregation, an 1897 law restricted prostitution to the Black and Creole section of the city, which became known as Storyville. As saloons and sporting houses began popping up throughout Storyville, they employed Black and Creole musicians who blended their music to create a new genre known as Dixieland Jazz. Dixieland Jazz consisted of a standard musical ensemble in which a trumpet or cornet carried the melody, while various other instruments played the rhythm section. The music blended the classical European music of many Creoles with ragtime, which was then an all-American music and blues. The structured style of Creole musician and the improvisational experimental style of Black musicians combined to produce a genre that was a mix of both. Storyville had become a hub of music and culture, but in 1917, Storyville was shut down. Many displaced musicians set off for cities like Memphis, Chicago, and New York. With new places and new people came new music.
In the early 1900s, the stage was set for Chicago jazz to evolve and take the music world by storm. Between 1910 and 1920, there was an influx of 60,000 blacks to Chicago, more than doubling its black population. Black jazz musicians from across the South came to Chicago, blending their music with that of the city's white jazz musicians to create a new, exciting sound. With the invention of the sound recording in 1909, jazz music, which is so improvisational that was rarely written down, could be enjoyed by the masses. Many famous Chicago jazz musicians, such as Louis Armstrong, rose to international fame.
Meanwhile, New York City was in the midst of the Harlem Renaissance, which led to an explosion of jazz and black music. Duke Ellington gave rise to a cool, sophisticated-sounding jazz that came to be called swing. Unlike Armstrong's jazz, which was considered hot jazz for its speed and complex improvisation, Duke Ellington's swing was carefully rehearsed and performed by a big band. Swing became a nationwide success.
Yet in spite of success, many prominent Black musicians dealt with racism. They were forced to stay at different hotels and eat at different restaurants. They worked more but were paid less. In the South, integrated bands weren't even allowed to play. As our nation entered the 1940s and the era of modern jazz begins, we were still plagued by an archaic system of social injustice.
Modern jazz grew out of the swing era of the 1930s. The earliest style of modern jazz, known as bop, can best be described as a collective rebellion against swing. Jazz musicians were tired of carefully rehearsed, repetitive mass appeal of swing and reverted to bop, a style that was fast-paced and aggressive. Bop was filled with complex melodies and a high degree of syncopation. Although bop was too fast-paced and complex to have a mass appeal, jazz musicians didn't care. Bop was a way to push limits and test their abilities. By the 1950s, jazz began a series of transitions. It transitioned from bop to cool and West Coast jazz to hard bop to modal jazz and free jazz. This was largely to Miles Davis, a jazz musician brimming with talent and creativity. In 1949, Davis formed an interracial band that became known for a unique sound, caused in part by the cool, subdued feeling of their solos. This created an overall delicate effect that was known as the birth of the cool. Cool jazz is a quiet form of jazz, with very few loud or high notes. Cool jazz had a strong influence on West Coast jazz, which had a light, cool, simple melody and was sometimes referred to as polite jazz.
And yet despite his success, Miles Davis faced racism. In 1959, he was beaten by a New York police officer while taking a breather between sets. As a result, he began taking a more active role in politics. The time was right. The civil rights movement emerged during the 1950s and blossomed during the 1960s. As African Americans fought for the rights and equality they deserve, jazz fought for the recognition it deserved. Long gone were the days when black music went unacknowledged and talents unrecognized. And yet jazz, when compared to white European classical music, was always deemed less complex and less technical. A famous jazz and classical musician named Wynton Marsalis refused to let that stand. In 1983, Marsalis became the first musician to win a Grammy for classical music and a Grammy for jazz. Marsalis was a firm believer that jazz was more intricate and technically demanding than classical music. Later in his career, Marsalis began to focus less on classical music and more on jazz, which he deemed the ultimate 20th century music.
Jazz constantly pushes boundaries. Jazz musicians throughout history have refused to let the racism that pervades the laws and institutions of our nation stand in the way of creating a masterpiece.
The evolution of jazz embodies the evolution of the African American experience. Jazz is all about testing limits and breaking boundaries. Jazz can be fast or slow, loud or quiet, soft or hard. hard, organized, or improvised, or anywhere in between. Jazz has evolved, and jazz has endured, and in spite of it all, jazz has and will continue to grow and thrive.